You're in for a real treat today. This is a special opportunity for me to have the pleasure of introducing my friend and colleague, Judge Jamie Baker, as your convocation speaker today. Judge Baker retired, which is a funny thing to think about for someone as young as Judge Baker. He retired from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces last July after 15 years of service, the last 4 of which he served as Chief Judge. As you may hear more about from Judge Baker in a moment, that court hears appeals arising under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Decisions of the court are subject to review only in the United States Supreme Court. During his time on the court, Judge Baker authored close to 300 opinions in the fields of criminal law and procedure, including questions of law covering the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, rules of evidence, and jurisdiction. Currently, Judge Baker is a visiting professor at Georgetown Law School. He's also the chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Law and National Security, where he tells me what to do. He's also a veteran mentor. He's on the editorial board of the Journal of National Security Law and Policy, where I tell him what to do. And he also has taught at a number of law schools, Yale, University of Iowa, Washington University in St. Louis, and Pittsburgh. Before becoming a judge, interestingly, Judge Baker served as special assistant to the president and legal advisor to the National Security Council during the Clinton years. He was deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council and counsel to the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and Intelligence Oversight Board. Those are big jobs, very important jobs in Washington. He's also served as an attorney in the Department of State, a legislative aide to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who began his career as a political science professor here at Syracuse University, and as a Marine Corps infantry officer. Judge Baker has written numerous books and articles. His awards include the 1999 Colonel Nelson Drew Memorial Award, which is the National Security Council's highest honor, and as the Director of Central Intelligence Director's Award. Judge Baker earned his bachelor's and law degrees from a small university in New Haven, known otherwise as Yale. Judge Baker, welcome to Syracuse.
Am I good? Can you hear me all right? I was all excited about that introduction, especially when I learned I get to assign you work, but you quickly counterattacked and said it's coming back at you. So we'll call it a draw. Thank you very much for the warm introduction, and more importantly, thank you for years of friendship. As you'll see that, let me try this again. Woodrow Wilson went to, this is just an impromptu, Woodrow Wilson went to the Naval Academy graduating class of 1916, and he was up there on the stage, and it was before presidents made the rounds around the academies, and they said, well, Mr. President, would you like to say anything? And so he got up, because he's a president, and he said to the midshipmen at the time, who were all male, he said, I want you to know that you're choosing a life of public service and of public duty, and in exchange for that, you will forever have the affection and respect of your fellow citizens. And my joke, which happens to be true, is I've been doing government service for 35 years, and I've yet to meet the affection part of the event. But I always did have a sense of friendship and bonding with Bill, so you'll get credit. That's the one box that I'll check there. But if you're looking for affection, don't go into public service. Thank you very much. Just skip that part. Okay, so here's my talk. I forgot what the title was that I gave Syracuse when I was asked to come and talk. I may have had something to do with this. But basically, when I'm given the opportunity to have a free talk, I make up a title, and then I talk about this. And this is what you need to know if you're going to be a successful lawyer. And the most important thing you need to know if you're going to be a successful lawyer, in my view, is who your role models are and what they stand for and how they're going to inform what you are as a lawyer and how you practice, okay? And so I come to this with these following basic start points. It gets more interesting in a moment. First of all, law schools spend, in my experience, most of their time trying to teach you to think like a lawyer, and far less of the time teaching you to act like a professional. And in my experience, the hard part of being a lawyer is the act like a professional part, not the think like a lawyer part. And so this is my small effort to remedy that imbalance. Second, when we take professional responsibility, first we take it our third year, in most cases. It should be the first course you take at law school because it should set the parameters around which you define the practice of law. And you should always remember that the model rules are the lowest standard of conduct, the minimal acceptable standard of conduct, not the high ideals that you should reach for. And you get the high ideals that you should reach for from our role models and what they've done. And then you can read as well as I can most of the challenges you will face in whatever profession you pursue, and in theory you might do some law along the way. Most of the challenges are going to be EQ and personality challenges, not IQ challenges. If you're here in this room today, you've got the IQ necessary to be a great lawyer. It's the EQ part which will define who you are. And then it turns out that the answer to most of the challenges and problems with being a national security lawyer are resolved through moral courage. The military spends a lot of time studying physical courage. They don't spend that much time working on moral courage. And it turns out that those of us who engage in public service, if we engage in it at all, it will be defined by our moral courage. So far, okay, so here I came up with a list of the biggest challenges of being a national security lawyer. Some of these apply to any practice of law. They all apply to national security law. And I'm not going to go through all of these. This is a menu, a sampling, but you can read some of them. Where's my little thingy here? Well, there it is. Whoop. Nope, not real. Obnoxious personality, yours and the client's. That's one of my favorites. Remember, it's your personality that's issue as well. Too little time, incomplete facts. You can get all that. The pressure to get to yes. You've seen that play out with some memos at OLC. Confidence too much, usually a male problem, and too little, sometimes a female problem. And then the challenge you didn't expect. This poor dog said, the guy came up and said, hey, do you want to go for a walk? And the next thing he knew, he was doing a halo jump from 10,000 feet with oxygen. That's a real shot. I love dogs and I collect dog pictures. So my students, if they want to brown nose me, give me dog pictures. And the game is to come up with the most unusual dog picture. This is a pretty unusual one. And you'll remember there was a dog on the raid, the Bin Laden raid as well. But here's an example of what I mean by the challenge you didn't expect. And I told this story at breakfast this morning. I was in a room full of African judge advocates going through this list with them, making the list up for them. Because we wanted to make a list of the challenges, and then that's fun. But the more important thing is to come up with the solutions to the challenges. And the first question I got said, oh, it's a great list, really like the list. Dog picture's nice too. But you didn't have my challenge on your list. And that challenge was what? And I said, what's the challenge? The person said, what do you do if there's a coup? Is the law worth dying for? And I said, oh yeah, that's not a challenge I've had, right? I don't worry about if there's a coup when I go to work at the White House. Is the law worth dying for? So we went through that, and I ended up answering the question with reference to a role model. Who is the role model? If you weren't at the breakfast, don't say. If you're at the breakfast, don't say. Who would you pick as a role model? If you're an African judge advocate and the question was, is the law worth dying for? Perfect. That's exactly who I picked at the time. I said Nelson Mandela at the Ravinia trial, when he stood up and he was on trial for his life, and he said, if needs be, I'm prepared to give my life for democracy and the law, for freedom and the law. Good role model, and then the question is, can you live up to that role model? Okay, so we're going to get to the role model piece here in a second. So how do you deal with these challenges? The first way you deal with them is you remember your key skills as a lawyer. It turns out that lawyers are good advocates and good at writing and good at speaking. You may not think that right now, but compared to other folks, you're actually well skilled at this. And if you get over the panic you're feeling at the moment of crisis and fall back on your actual skills, you'll find how much easier it is to deal with the crisis. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. The lawyer's toolkit, that's knowing everything you know, right? Practicing law is hard enough. Dealing with the challenges you can't control, right? You don't know what the crisis is going to be. You don't know what the personalities are you're going to have to work with. The one thing you always can know is you can know all law, right? That's on you. Don't show up without knowing everything. So I walk around with these kinds of templates in my head. I actually dream in these templates. I'll have a dream about, ghosts and witches or something, and I'll apply international law and covert action statutes to it. It's a real burden, but it's true. And that's what you get when you make up these templates. And then anticipative guidance, that's you figuring out what is the challenge I'm going to have, what kind of challenges. If I had on the slide before, one of the challenges, what do you do when the client won't follow your advice? Well, rather than say, gee, I hope that doesn't happen, how about coming up with some guidance ahead of time that you can share with somebody else about how to deal with that? So that's what this is. This is the Army's version of what to do when your client doesn't follow your advice. They didn't say, oh, let's hope it never happens. They said, here's a checklist of things you can do. Okay? I'm getting up to the good stuff. Know what you stand for, right? It's a lot easier to deal with crisis and remain calm in difficult situations when you know what you ultimately stand for. What principle will I live and die for? What principle will I be prepared to resign over? What principle am I prepared to get fired over? If you're thinking about that for the first time, when it happens, it's too late. Let me go back. And then, of course, knowing what you stand for, you have to have the moral courage to actually act upon those principles. And in my experience, the thing that helped me do that, to the extent I did it at all, these are some of the things you might stand for. We'll do that more. In my experience, the thing that helped me most, at least try to stand up for my principles, was to think through my role models and to think about who did I learn moral courage from. Here's a definition of moral courage. I take it from Field Marshal Slim. Any of you ever hear of Field Marshal Slim before? So very popular here. Nobody's ever heard of Field Marshal Slim. Wonderful person. He was the World War I veteran, World War II veteran. He received the British equivalents to the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star. He was wounded 4 times. Why is all that relevant? Because he talks about physical courage and moral courage. And of the two, he says, by far the rarer of the two is moral courage. And that's the courage that lawyers practice, right? If you're practicing physical courage, we have a big problem. You should be practicing moral courage. I also like him because he said a couple things. First of all, this is my idea of humor. You can disagree. Max Hastings, who's a World War II historian, said of all the British generals during the Second World War, he was the only general who was a normal human being. And that, to me, is the funniest thing ever. I don't like Field Marshal Montgomery, and so that's basically a poke at Field Marshal Montgomery. And then the other thing I like, Field Marshal Slim had an army in India and Burma comprised of folks from 10 different nations representing at least 10 different religions. And he was able to hold them all together because he was able to communicate high ideals in simple language. You'll see that again, okay? So I go to Field Marshal Slim for my definition of moral courage, mainly because he has the standing to say what I don't have the standing to say, which is moral courage is a rare thing, and it is much rarer than physical courage. Although we celebrate physical courage, certainly in the military, in a way we don't celebrate moral courage. So where do we learn our moral courage from? I think we learned it in part from our role models and the example they set. Here are some of my role models, and by the way, I have pages and pages of them. Because it's your lucky day, I'm only going to talk about 43 of my role models today. The most important role model in my life was my mother right there sporting the John Adams hairdo. You see, There she is. She copied John Adams' hairdo. And I say that because I don't expect you to have my role models as your role models. It'd be really weird if you had my mother as your role model. But in fact, let me meet you outside afterwards if that's the case. But what I want you to do is think through, who are your role models? My first day, it was probably my second, third day at the NSC when I was the deputy legal advisor. I'd been a lawyer for 3 years, and I was called into the legal advisor's office. And the legal advisor said, I want you to go to a principals meeting. Do you know what a principals meeting is? Nobody? Anybody? Okay, principals meeting is, the National Security Council is the highest deliberative and decision-making body in the United States government for national security decisions. The president is the chair of the NSC. When the president is not in the meeting, it's a principals meeting. It's the principal cabinet officers of all the national security departments and agencies. So it's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the DNI, the National Security Advisor, and so on. You get the gist of it? So the legal advisor calls me into his office and said, I want you to go to a principals meeting. And I said, oh, that's pretty neat. I'm going to get to go to a principals meeting, watch it, and figure out how to be a better lawyer within this NSC process. So I said, when's the meeting so I can put it on my calendar? And he said, now. And I said, today? And he said, no, now. It's already started. So then I realized that's why I was going to the meeting, because I was the guy who was going to walk in on the middle of this group of people and say, hi, you've never met me before, but I'm going to go ahead and join this meeting. So I walked over to the West Wing, and I was so sweaty and nervous looking that the Secret Service folks let me in without a badge, because I didn't have one yet. And then I said, once I got past them, I said, oh, by the way, can you tell me where the Situation Room is? So they really knew I was in trouble. And fortunately, one of the principals wasn't there yet. So I didn't have to walk in on the middle of the meeting, which would have been weird. That's the good news. The bad news, it was principals only meeting, meaning no staff except for me. So that alleviated the problem of knowing where to sit once I figured out I shouldn't sit at the table, right? So I didn't want to sit inside. So I picked the seat that was closest to the door for fleeing. That's my joke, but it made sense because you control information in and out. And it was also the seat closest to the National Security Advisor in case I had to pass him a note or wave at him or do something. It turned out that was quite relevant. So the meeting starts, and not 30 seconds into the meeting, it turns out the only reason the principals are meeting is to talk about a legal issue. And so I'm going, looking around the room, and the only other lawyer in the room, the only other person who is acting as a lawyer is the Attorney General of the United States. And it turns out this is not an issue the Attorney General of the United States will know anything about. So I'm thinking, now what? Am I supposed to? So I sat there, and the National Security Advisor turns to me and says, well, Jamie, can you brief us on this issue? By the way, the book of lawyering says prepare for meetings beforehand, okay? This is not the correct method. And I said, of course. And no one knew who I was. So I started and I said, the question presented is blah, blah, blah. And on the one hand, blah, 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 and on the other hand, blah, blah. And I got as far as blah, blah. And a cabinet person went, and I can't say it in this room. It ended with T. And this person then proceeded to go on for 10 minutes. It felt like a couple of days, saying how dumb I was, that I was the worst lawyer this person had ever seen, ever heard, didn't know why I was in the meeting, didn't belong there, and I should get the heck out of the room. So I'm thinking, am I supposed to get the heck out of the room? What am I supposed to do? And there comes a time in any meeting where, at least in my world, where I grew up in the Marine Corps, there's a lot of yelling in the Marine Corps, as it turns out. But there's always that point in a meeting where the commanding officer says, "Don't you talk to my people like that," and conveys that loyalty down the chain of command that the book says they're supposed to convey, and kills the yelling. And so I looked over at the National Security Advisor thinking, yeah, 10 minutes or so is about the time you're supposed to step in and say, let's raise the level of conversation. And the National Security Advisor is smiling. And it's pretty clear this is the most fun he has ever had at a Principals Committee meeting. So I'm getting no support there. So I'm like, how's this going to end? So eventually he turns to me and goes, well, Jamie, what's your response? And basically all the person had said was, you're dumb. So I'm like, well, I'm not sure what my response to that's supposed to be. So I said, perhaps I wasn't as clear as I should have been. The question presented is blah, blah, blah. On the one hand, on the other hand, exact same thing happened. Exact same thing happened. I'm like, no wonder there's policy issues. Nobody can make a decision in here because they're all yelling at the lawyer. And it just went on and on. And then I passed the National Security Advisor a note. And I say, Tony, it appears that we're at an impasse. Perhaps I should convene the General Counsel of the relevant agencies tonight, and we will identify the questions presented and provide a uniform response with dissent if necessary by first thing tomorrow morning. Okay? So that was the solution to the problem. And as we're walking out, you're going to ask, why am I telling you this story? As we're walking out of the meeting, this is not why. We're walking out of the meeting, the Attorney General puts her arm around me, and she's a lot taller than me, so it is Janet Reno. She puts her arm around me, and she goes, way to go, Jamie, way to stick up for the law. And my first instinct was to say, hey, wait a second, everybody get back in. The AG has something she wants to say. But later I would learn that the AG's in a tough spot, because if the AG speaks, the game's over on the law. And this way, she could have the liberty to overrule anything I had said and so on. But the truth of the matter is, the one thing I was thinking in there the whole time, this is true, I wasn't thinking about the substance of the law. I wasn't framing Q&A. I wasn't creating my talking points. I was thinking about my role models. And I was thinking about 3 role models. I was thinking about my mother, my high school English teacher, who I was not getting any substantive law help from, and my high school biology teacher. And if you know me in science, I didn't learn anything, but he was a great role model. And I was thinking about the 3 of them, and I was saying to myself, I'll be darned if I was going to let the 3 of them down who spent so many years of their lives trying to build my confidence up. I was a very shy kid, and they spent years trying to develop my voice. And I was not going to let them down the first time it was put to the test. And I was prepared to get fired on the spot. I didn't quite know when, whether it'd be in the middle of the meeting, halfway through, whatever. But I was not going to let them down. And it was because of my mother and Gene Poole and Bob O'Brien. So I want to share with you 3 of my other role models, okay? And these are just some of them. You get a menu. And I'm going to 2 of them are very close friends. One of them is not someone I had the good fortune to know. But at one time, how many of you have ever heard of Frank Johnson? Right. In Jamie Baker land, no one would be allowed to graduate from law school if they didn't know about Frank Johnson. Frank Johnson at one point was the most famous federal judge in the United States of America. He was on the cover of Time magazine, as you can see. And the reason you should know about him is because he helped to set the highest standards and ideals of the law. How's that? Here's his life story in a nutshell. He grew up in Winston County, Alabama, which was the northern county in Alabama. About half the people, male age during the Civil War, served in the Union forces. About half served in the Confederate States Army. He was very proud of being from Winston County because of its independence. This is a good trait if you're a judge, as it turns out. He went to the University of Alabama Law School. He was in the class of 1943. And as you can see here, and some of you will be able to detect this, he was in the same class as George Wallace. They were friends and classmates. Anybody here not know who George Wallace was? Who's willing to admit it? Okay, good for you. George Wallace was the segregationist governor of Alabama for most of the civil rights era, whose theory of politics can best be summed up by his statement, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That gives you a sense of who he was. Later, he would change his views, but remember, in the context of the current debate, his presidential campaign, George Wallace's presidential campaign, is most like, and you draw the line to Donald Trump's campaign. But that's true. I mean, that's what people have said it reminds them of. But anyway, it's fascinating that they were in the same law school class. You'll see why in a second. It's World War II. It's 1943. Frank Johnson goes into the Army after law school. He does not sign up as a lawyer. Rather, he signs up as an infantry officer because he wants to serve as an infantry officer. And he lands, that's not an actual depiction, but he lands at Normandy at D+3 or D+5, 5 days or 3 days after the initial landings, depending on which interview you rely on. And he was wounded shortly thereafter, crawling through a hedge grove in Normandy. He did not get evacuated to the UK. Instead, they did the movie thing. They poured sulfa powder into his wound, patched him up, and sent him back to his platoon. He was wounded a second time when a shell blew up in front of him and riddled his body with shrapnel. And they had to evacuate him to the United Kingdom to save his life. He recuperates, and at that point, the Army is looking for a lawyer to represent two sergeants. And they find Frank Johnson, they realize he's a lawyer, they make him a law officer, and they say, you're going to defend these two sergeants. And the two sergeants had been accused of abusing prisoners at the barracks, the prison, where they put all the American deserters during the Second World War. And it turned out that the deserters were being beaten, and in one case, murdered. And General Eisenhower said, enough of this, we're going to have an investigation. And in classic bureaucratic manner, the Army determined it was all the fault of these two sergeants. Sounds like some other prisoner abuse scandals. And it turned out the sergeant said, we were just doing what the command wanted us to do, and we were directed to do. And by the way, it wasn't us that killed the guy. And Frank Johnson defended them, and he did something back then that nobody had ever done before. He called the major general, in other words, a general, he called the major general to the stand and cross-examined him on the command climate he had set at the prison. It never happened before, and it made front-page Washington Post news. Ruth Johnson, who's there on the left, who outranked her husband as a lieutenant commander, heard the paperboy say, extra, extra, read all about it. Lieutenant tells off Major General. And Ruth immediately said, Frank is in trouble. She knew it was her husband in his role as a lawyer. He ended up having the sergeants acquitted of all the serious offenses they received, 6 months for dereliction of duty. And he went back to Winston. He was soon after demobilized, interestingly enough. The Army had had enough of him. And he went home to Winston County, Alabama with a Bronze Star for Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and he went into private practice. Most lawyers in the United States practice how? As solo practitioners. 50% of the lawyers in the United States practice as solo practitioners. And then about 75% practices solo practitioners or 2 to 5 people law firms. He went to a 2-person law firm. He was the associate. The other guy was the partner. And that was his mentor. And then he ran General Eisenhower's campaign in Veterans for Eisenhower in Alabama. And then Frank Johnson became the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. And then at the age of 37, he was interviewed by the president. President Eisenhower interviewed all federal judges personally before nominating them. And at the age of 37, he was appointed federal district court judge in Montgomery, Alabama. 3 weeks after his investiture, Rosa Parks refused to take her seat at the back of the bus, and it was assigned to Frank Johnson's courtroom. And based on, and you'll learn this in federal courts, based on the law that existed from 1910 to 1976, constitutional challenges to state laws had to be heard by 3 judge panels. And so he was one of the 3 judges that, in a 2-to-1 decision, that invalidated Alabama's practice of segregated buses. And as they say, the rest is history. Every other civil rights case in Alabama was brought to Frank Johnson's courtroom. Why? Because he sat in Montgomery, Alabama, and therefore that's where you brought the challenges to state action. And it was Frank Johnson that desegregated the schools, desegregated the buses, desegregated the swimming pools, blah, blah, blah. Every single institution that was segregated in Alabama, Frank Johnson desegregated. And he paid a price for it. No one would talk to him. And as you can see by looking at the board, his mother's house was blown up because they thought he lived there, because her name was Mrs. Frank Johnson. He was Frank Johnson, Jr. And he was ostracized in his community. And he also, by the way, was the guy who enjoined the Department of Public Safety in Alabama from blocking the Selma to Montgomery march. He also called the marchers in and told them that if they blocked both lanes in the highway, he'd hold them in contempt and lock them up, because the citizens of Alabama had the right to go about their business, even as they had their right to go about protesting. Why do I like Frank Johnson? Well, it's hard not to like a person like that, right? But he put the high ideals of the Constitution into the simple language of action. He said the segregation cases were the easiest cases he ever heard, because the Constitution was so clear on equal protection and due process. He also reminds us, remember, he was 37, he'd served as an Army officer, he was a regular human being. He was not, in fact, born in a judicial robe. Some judges think they were born that way. Frank Johnson was not. All of you can live up to the Frank Johnson standard because you have the exact same background he does. You won't land at Normandy and you won't have the Rosa Parks case, but you have the same background. And if he's remembered at all, and clearly he's not remembered, he's remembered for his moral courage, not for his physical courage at Normandy, and that's something worth keeping in mind as well. Okay, my next role model, I'm doing all right here because I don't spend as much time on the next two. Here's my next one, John Sparks. John Sparks was my recruiter in the Marine Corps. I was a walk-in, so it was a pretty easy quota, but that's how I first knew John Sparks. John Sparks was a beneficiary of Frank Johnson's rulings and the Fifth Circuit's rulings. He grew up in Georgia, segregated Georgia. One of his first memories is of his father whisking him out of a police station because he had drunk at the wrong fountain and was about to be beaten. And his father, who was a sergeant in the Army, came in uniform, grabbed him, and ran out. John enlisted in the Navy. That's his Navy boot camp picture. We helpfully have circled him to pick him out. And so he was an E1 in the Navy, the junior most enlisted rank. He then was eventually selected to go to the Navy prep school and go to the Naval Academy. And he graduated in 1976 from the Naval Academy and wisely chose the Marine Corps option and became an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. There he is in his Marine Corps uniform, and he then becomes my recruiter, and proving that you should always be careful who you piss off. When I became the deputy at the NSC, I called up the Marine Corps because I always wanted to have a judge advocate in the office. And I called up the Marine Corps and I said, will you please assign a judge advocate to my office? And the uniform side of the Marine Corps said no, and I called the civilian council of the Marine Corps up, and he said immediately, who would you like and when would you like them there? And I said, John Sparks, tomorrow morning will work. So the next morning, John Sparks reports to my office wondering why the heck he's been sent to the NSC, and he walks in, and there I am, and he knows it. This is getting back at the recruiter. He's also the only type B personality that ever worked at the NSC. This is an empirical fact. I could do John Sparks stories all day long. They're all type B personality stories. But I'm going to tell you one. I got a call one day from the exec. That's like the chief of staff to the NSC staff. And he was a military officer, so that meant every other word out of his mouth was a cuss word. Between the words, I heard John Sparks fired, everyone's angry in the West Wing. So I said, I think there's a problem. So I put the phone down, I went into John's office, and I said, hey, John, is everything okay? Now remember, John is, at this point, a colonel in the Marine Corps, working for the President of the United States, known as the Commander-in-Chief, and he was a graduate of the Naval Academy. So I said, John, is everything okay? Any reason why everybody's angry at you? Everything's fine. Thanks for checking. Okay. That's how John is, too. So I call the exec back and I say, thanks for your call. I've checked on John and he's doing very well. No problems. And I get a lot of stuff back. Says, very funny, you better fix the problem and fix it now or he's gone by the end of the day. And I said, well, I really don't know what the problem is. Perhaps you should tell me. He said, here's the problem. The President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, invited John Sparks to go with him on Air Force One and sit with him at the Army-Navy football game. And John said no. You don't have to be in the military to understand that there's something that's not the correct answer. And so using my power of deduction, I say, I see the problem. So I go back into John's office and I go, John, you sure there's not a reason why everybody's angry at you? He goes, no reason at all. And I said, John, have you received any invitations recently? And I'm telling the truth. He said no. I worked there 7.5 years. I never got an invitation. If I'd gotten one, I would have remembered it. So I said, okay, let me try it a different way, John. Did the President of the United States invite you to the Army-Navy football game? He goes, oh yeah, he did. And what did you say? I said no. Why? He said, because Corporal Smith used to work with me in Navy General Counsel's office, and she called 2 weeks ago and asked if I would give her family a tour of the White House this weekend, and she asked first. There's not a human being alive, and certainly that ever worked there, that would have responded that way, that would have put Corporal Smith, a junior enlisted person, before the President of the United States. But of course, it also illustrates the point that most ethical dilemmas have solutions. So I said to John, there's a solution here. Why don't I go to the Army-Navy football? No. I said, John, this is why I always like having John around, because he's the most honorable guy in the world. And I always can count on him on my right or my left, period. But I said, why don't I give Corporal Smith the tour of the White House, and you go to the Army-Navy football game, and everybody's a winner. And so I called back and I said, making it clear I knew what had happened, I said, I think there's some confusion. I think what John meant to say was yes. And somehow it got communicated as no. And all was well again. And I'm pleased to report that John then, to demonstrate that payback is a continuous problem, John then became the Deputy General Counsel of the Department of Navy, Acting General Counsel of the Department of Navy, having started off as an E1, only in the United States. And he spent the last 15 years serving as my chief clerk on the court of which I was a judge, or am a judge still. And 5 days ago, he was confirmed to take my place as a judge, the first clerk we ever know of that has taken the place of the judge that he was clerking for sequentially, and he'll be the first African-American judge to serve on my court in 35 years' time. Pretty cool, right? Only in America. So here's my last person. And I'm okay? You're good. Okay. Jack Downey. Jack Downey was a judge, and we're gonna do this then, right? This was Q&A versus, okay. Jack Downey, the courthouse in New Haven, Connecticut, the Juvenile Justice Courthouse. How many of you ever hear of Jack Downey? Yeah, it's like Frank Johnson. Jack Downey is a little more remote. The courthouse in New Haven is named after him, the Jack Downey Juvenile Justice Courthouse and Detention Center. And he would be the first to tell you there's a lot of irony there. He served his 35 years as a juvenile justice judge in New Haven, Connecticut. That's on the front lines of justice, the hardest jobs in the world, making and breaking lives and changing lives for the better. He did it for 35 years. Here's the irony. This was his second career, and he knew a lot about detention. His first career was as a CIA officer. He served in the CIA. He was a class in 1951 from Yale. He had missed World War II, so he wanted to serve his country. He joined the CIA, and his first assignment was to run agents into Manchuria, into northern China. They drop him out of aircraft, and the idea was to cause a second revolution and overthrow the Chinese, the communists who had won China in 1949. And then during the Korean War, the idea further was to engage in acts of sabotage to draw PLA units off of the Korean Peninsula and back into northern China. It didn't work. But there came a time when one of the cells that Jack Downey was running said they had a very high-level defector that wanted to come out, and they had to come in and pick him up. And the methodology for picking up someone back then, sort of out of a James Bond movie, but a lot simpler, was to throw this swing set out the back of a CH-47, and then the guy would hook himself into the sling, and you'd come back and hook it, and then reel him in the back. And it was such a secret mission, because the defector was so high level, that they said the normal crew of the aircraft could not go. It had to be American case officers who would go because of the secrecy. So they took Jack Downey and his buddy Richard Fechtow, who had been there for 2 weeks, and they said, you're going to go run the swing set thing. And they practiced once, and then they sent them off. It was in winter, and they came in, and they saw the signs and countersigns, so they said, these are the agents, and that's our guy in the sling. So they came around again, and as they were about to pick the guy up, machine guns opened up from all over the place. And it was an ambush. The Chinese had turned the agents, and they had lured the Americans in, and then they shot the aircraft down. The pilot and co-pilot were killed immediately, and Jack Downey and Richard Fechtow fell out of the back of the plane and were captured. Their families were told that they were dead and had died in a plane crash in the Sea of Japan. No bodies recovered. And that was the end of Jack Downey and Richard Fechtow. Except they were alive and they were being interrogated in China in 1952 for the next 2 years without anybody knowing it. They're in solitary confinement, and then 2 years into that, they're brought together for a trial, an espionage trial. And it's the first time Downey and Fechtow have seen each other during that time period. And they come into the courtroom, and as the practice, they assigned them each a lawyer, and Downey turned to his lawyer and said, aren't you going to give me any advice? And the lawyer said, good luck. And that was all he said. And as was the practice, they moved immediately to the sentencing phase of the trial. And there were all the agents that Downey had been running in China. And they went down the line. And if you had cooperated with the government, you got 5 or 10 years. If you had not, you got death. And Downey was at the end, and they went down death, death, 10 years, death. And then Fechtow got 20 years. And Downey got life. And life meant life. There's no parole in China then. And that was it. His family then was told, and the CIA for the first time realized these guys were still alive. And as Jack Downey would say, to make a really long and boring story shorter and boring, he spent the next 21 years plus in China in prison. 6 straight years of it in solitary confinement. They used to do this thing where they drive him to the border and say, you're going to get released. They drive him to the border, then they turn around and say, ha, no, you aren't. So he refused to learn Chinese because he did not want to acknowledge that he'd spend the rest of his life in China. He learned Russian instead, which got him in trouble because when the Russians split with China, they blamed him for, it was his fault. And what did he read? He read the collected works of Stalin, which was the literature he was allowed to read. In any event, when ping-pong diplomacy occurred, and Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon opened up relations again with China in 1971 and 72, they raised the Jack Downey case. And they said and the Chinese said, forget it. But at the 20-year mark, Richard Fechtower was released. Then when Mrs. Downey was about to die, Henry Kissinger called Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, and said, could you please let Jack Downey come home as a humanitarian and diplomatic gesture? And the Chinese said, yes, if President Nixon admits he is a CIA officer. So there's a press conference where President Nixon gets up and he's talking about soybean crops and corn crops or something. I can't remember what these things were. And he goes, the soybean crop is really good, Jack Downey is a CIA officer, and the corn crop's really good as well. And that's exactly how it was. And Downey was shortly thereafter being released. That's a picture of him being released. He's moving into Hong Kong. He gets saluted by a British police officer, and he says it's the first act of human dignity he had received in the last 21 plus years. And here's the message. What did he do? He came home, and he went to law school. He could have been angry, bitter. He could have been a lot of things. He didn't ask for anything from his government. He applied to law school. Yale would not admit him because he was connected to the CIA. A school that let CIA openly recruit on campus now said, we don't like CIA, you can't come here. So he went to Harvard Law School, the lesser option, and he had a great time. He said he was the happiest law student in the history of Harvard. Why? He was a 44-year-old man with a 22-year-old mind, and he had 21 years of salary saved up. He said there wasn't a week at Harvard he didn't have a party. But here's the message. What did he do? What did he do when he graduated? He became a judge. He applied through the meritorious selection process to be a Superior Court judge in New Haven, Connecticut. He could have been anything. He could have demanded anything. Instead, he did what I think is the hardest job, juvenile justice. And he did it with great honor for 35 years, day in and day out, never asking for anything from his government. No special treatment. I used to watch him in court because no one else knew who he was. I'd watch him and I'd say, it's unbelievable that this person can do it with such dignity and grace. So I called him up one day. I'm almost done. I called him up one day and I said, could I buy you a beer? I'd been waiting. I knew about him since I was a kid. Always wanted to buy the guy a beer, even when I was a kid. And I called him up and I said, could I buy you a beer? And he said, well, who are you? But we went out. It's the only time I've ever been thrown out of a bar. It sounds really cool, doesn't it? I'm a Marine, so getting thrown out of a bar is a big, important. And it's because we had a beer each and we stayed for 5 hours talking. And he became a surrogate grandfather to my kids, a role model to me, and he became a role model to me at age 76. And when he came to my house for dinner, I said to my kids, an American hero is coming to dinner tonight. Watch this person and learn from him. And they stood at the picture window. And then he drives up and he has Parkinson's. He had Parkinson's. And he shuffles to the front door. And both my kids look at me like, huh? And then they listened to him talk at dinner. And they both came up to me and whispered in my ear, you're right. It was magic. And I want you to know about Jack Downey because he deserves to be known about. He received finally the CIA's highest medal for heroism, their Medal of Honor, just 2 years ago, a year before he died. But think about his contributions to the law. Think about the fact that he didn't even start his career till he was 47, right? So if you're worried about being the AG by the time you're 30, forget it. He started his career when he was 47, and he never complained a day of his life. And every time I'm feeling sorry for myself, which is constantly, I say to myself, what are you doing, knucklehead? Jack Downey's best day, this is true from his mouth, his best day for 21 years was when there was pigeon in the soup. So whenever I'm feeling sorry about myself and forgetting the honor of serving the law, I say, this is a pigeon soup day, get with it. So now I'd just like to conclude, since I know I'm up against the clock, and you can say you have a judicial order allowing you to go to class late. So ordered. Know what you stand for, know what you stand for, and this is a lovely quote from Nelson Mandela from Robin's prison. He didn't know he'd get out. He used one of his 2 letters that he had per year to write a lady who had written to him about the anti-apartheid movement and said, how can you do it? Don't you despair that you'll never get out. Nice warm words. And he wrote back that sometimes it's enough, and it's rewarding enough to know that you've done your duty when you've been asked to do your duty. And he was prepared to spend the rest of his life in prison. And then Jack Downey had Whit Griswold as his professor and was familiar, I would like to say familiar with this quote, but not really, but he was familiar with Whit Griswold and what he had learned from him. And Whit Griswold knew what he stood for. He defined self-respect, and you can see that, which comes to us in quiet moments and quiet places, when we suddenly realize that knowing the good, we have done it, knowing the beautiful, we have served it, and knowing the truth, we have spoken it. I keep that by my desk. That's what I always try to live up to every day. I'm not saying I do. All I'm saying is I try to. And then this is my last slide. The very first picture I showed you was a courtroom, right? That was Frank Johnson's courtroom. And there was a time when Frank Johnson was not allowed to walk the streets of Montgomery without being sneered at, spat on, and people would cross the side of the road. Eventually, however, you see the red roofed building there? They named the Federal District Courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama, the Frank Johnson Courthouse. Better yet, you see that picture there and there. That's a water fountain with Hebe at the top, the daughter, of course, of Zeus and Hera. And it's the same location where in the antebellum South they used to buy and sell slaves. And in Montgomery, Alabama, if you walk just a few yards down from the Frank Johnson Courthouse, you can see the fountain and the location where they sold slaves in antebellum South. And it also shows you the march of history and the power of the law. For forevermore, the Frank Johnson Courthouse will overlook the fountain where they sold the slaves, showing the triumph of the law and the triumph of people like Frank Johnson, John Sparks, and Jack Downey. And you can do that too as a lawyer. Remember that. The law is inspiring, and it's for doing good for others. And you have that opportunity. So thank you very much. Thank you.